Thank you, and good morning. The law of unintended consequences is commonly used as a wry or humorous warning against the hubristic belief that humans can fully control the world around them. I'm going to discuss what this notion might mean in the context of delivering successful buildings, and in particular, with reference to the lessons of the past, explore how we might design buildings that will better stand the test of time. I'm fascinated by the process of learning and frustrated when we neglect to seek out and deploy the benefits of past experiences. I'm also increasingly convinced that a successful outcome is totally linked to the clarity of vision and the way in which this is articulated in a brief from client or owner to designer or constructor. I want to explore how building users or occupants are also pivotal in this equation, and ask how they are reflected in the vision, the design solution, and the successful performance in use. How success is measured is part of the formula too, and I will ask whether this is adequately considered and identified. Running through all of this is time itself, the time it's taken to accrue the lessons of the past, the time it takes to redeploy them in new situations, and the drivers for innovation. In our modern world, the time seems to tick faster than that of our forebearers. We're expecting quicker outcomes, and we believe technology can aid every aspect of design, if not our lives. My question is, how we resolve these two versions of learning over time: the long-wave, analog world of the past and the data-rich, short-term digital environment of today. There are two aspects of historic learning I'd like to single out: responding to or moderating the climate through robust and passive means, and the response to increased scale and intensity of occupation. Some of the greatest and most historic civilizations in what we would consider to be rather more challenging climates for environmental design than our own temperate Northern European one include the classic civilizations of the Middle East, Greece, Egypt, and Rome. A clear understanding of seasonal extremes, the risk of damaging natural events, at least as far as they knew of them from their own past, and basic thermodynamics allowed a combination of passive solutions and simple active approaches to successfully deal with a wide range of external temperatures, humidity levels, and useful and unwanted solar gains. Think of thermal mass and night cooling, narrow streets, overhangs, fountains in courtyards, wind catchers, screens, and even evaporative cooling internally through wetted surfaces, the forerunner of, if you like, building services today. Where people ventured from these drier regions into higher latitudes in search of game, materials, or just space, they recognised the extremes of climate required different approaches appropriate to their means and nomadic lifestyles that would allow them to cope in particular with wetter and colder conditions. From the year-round thermal inertia afforded by a rock cave to the recognition of the Inuit that snow and ice themselves provided insulation against colder air temperatures and protection against wind chill, people's survival was entirely linked to their understanding of climate and weather. Comfort wasn't really the issue for these people. You either survived or you didn't. When they could, of course, they would have travelled south or gone to lower altitudes for the winter months. But with increasing pressures on population, even in historic time, this option has diminished. In tropical regions, there are different kinds of challenges to moderating climate to a level for healthy and comfortable living. Here, higher humidity, lower diurnal ranges, and monsoon seasons are reflected in lightweight, very breathable buildings which seek to maximise air movement. The buildings themselves might have a short life due to the perils of extreme flood events, so they might include stilts for protection, or here as a means of providing ready-made water transport. They're made of reusable, locally sourced materials, not so much designed for dismantling, but they're certainly salvageable, re-erectable, and readily replaceable. When the Romans came to Britain, and certainly if they arrived this week, it must have been quite a shock for them, certainly thermally. They brought with them a love of bathing in naturally warm waters, and the original version of underfloor heating. Even if we latched on to the benefits of a hot bath rather more quickly, it's interesting to reflect that it's taken us about 2 millennia to feel happy to routinely deploy underfloor heating, the same thermodynamic principle in our homes and workplaces. Of course, without an empire to draw on, we do have a slightly different attitude to the consumption of resources and the production and cost of associated energy. It's been rare for an empire to grow without rivalry. Eventually, the empire expands to push up against other peoples, states, or indeed other empires who resist being subsumed. Or the success of the empire might simply be resented to the extent that others will unite against it. This, of course, has always meant conflict, battle, and war, whether in defence or attack. If you consider the intensity of technological development in time, and particularly the most successful deployment of learning as innovation across historic time, this has been associated with war and conflict. With the rise of states and empires, their success and survival was therefore about military supremacy and keeping ahead of the opposition, and this historically drove innovation and improvement, both in physical and societal terms. And this has remained true to the beginning of our own modern era. The advancements in physics, chemistry, and applied engineering, together with fundamental changes to social behaviours and attitudes demanded by the Second World War, are the platform for the technological progress in the latter half of the 20th century, so in our lifetimes. Today, the successful global empire is probably measured more accurately in GDP. Wealth equals power, as opposed to the historic power equals wealth. Returning to the built environment, with the combination of successful empires or states and the rise of trade of everything from food and materials to labour and precious objects, came both cities and increasingly challenges of scale. Religious devotion, mass entertainment both demanded larger buildings, housing greater numbers and greater densities of people. The qualities sought in the creation of these buildings were much rather focused on grandeur, stability, knowledge and power. They were the robust embodiment of the religion or the regime in stone. Having said that, it's interesting to see that a very recent analysis of the Colosseum against a contemporary Olympic arena, the Bird's Nest in Beijing, indicates a highly developed understanding of crowd movement, efficient crowd movement, by Roman engineers well ahead of their time. So what have the Romans ever done for us? Engineering. In Britain, our largest and most densely occupied buildings remained as churches and cathedrals and sometimes theatres until the 18th or 19th centuries. There were hospitals, market halls and schools with varying degrees of consideration of the importance of effective ventilation and heating, although generally these were still relatively small in scale. With the agricultural and subsequently industrial revolutions came new building typologies: the mill, the factory, the railway station, and the rapid growth of city living, which in turn increased the scale of all the communal buildings and demanded better understanding of comfort, that is, heating, ventilation, light and acoustics, and of course hygiene, the great legacy of the Victorian era, water and sanitation. Today in London, we still rely very much on the rigorously designed infrastructure of the Victorian era. Their careful consideration of function and performance might not have sought long-term adaptability, but by getting many of the passive and sometimes active fundamentals right, we're still able to live in their houses, learn in their schools, travel from their stations, and rework their buildings. It was, of course, also their ability to wrap up this functionality with great decoration and craft that provides part of the enduring long-term appeal. And I would argue that ultimately, without successful functionality, performance and adaptability, these buildings would not have stood the test of time. So today, we cherish and protect historic buildings, but do we learn enough from them? If this whistle-stop tour of history of the built environment is rather simplistic and racing past too many related aspects, I'm sorry, but time does constrain me this morning, and I'd like to jump forward to the modern day. There's a great interest at present in modern methods of construction or design for manufacture and assembly, here, for example, expressed in the Leadenhall building. For me, there's still a role for craft in this process, just as the Victorians turned to mass production of components which were previously created on the construction site, or at least very locally to it. We're now doing the same. So I think the craft today is in the design of the components and their application and their adaptability. In our relatively stable and peaceful times, do we have the confidence to innovate without the imperative of war? I think the answer is resoundingly yes, and we're beginning to understand better the importance, success, or indeed failure sometimes, of innovations from within our lifetimes, the second half of the 20th century. I'm going to suggest, maybe controversially, that the notion of modern, more often than not, places aesthetic style over passive common sense and drives us towards more active solutions rather than passive ones. And these are at odds with our low-carbon agenda today. Of course, itself something of a misnomer. We're also more focused on capital rather than operational value, and yet ultimately the passive should cost no more than the active if we apply a truly balanced measure. Yes, there are building typologies where intensity of load or special environmental needs require greater energy and reliance on active systems. Of course, these buildings can use passive techniques, and some indeed do, but what I'm talking about here are our most common new building forms of scale, that is, the office, particularly in London, the apartment block, the university department, the school, and even the airport. I firmly believe we need to remember and deploy the lessons learned over long periods of time in whichever part of the world we're commissioning, designing, constructing and operating our buildings. It's pleasing to me to see that whilst the austerity cost basis of new state schools is certainly questionable, for the first time their technical specifications consider performance in use and require the establishment and maintenance of a robust feedback loop between design and operation. Which brings me to the subject of measurement of success and the role of occupants and users in achieving this. What's the success yardstick that you apply? Is it capital cost? Maybe it's peer recognition in the form of an RIBA award or a rapid pre-let, or maybe a 100-year life, or a long-term return on investment through low operational costs because of passive design measures. You'd probably be pleased to achieve all or any of these, depending on your role, but there's always a priority for you in the process. And I would question whether this is adequately articulated in the brief. I was very lucky to be part of the Arup team working on the delivery of the Sainsbury Laboratory in Cambridge, which Farah has mentioned. This is a pure research building into plant science associated with the fundamental survival of species. I felt the single most important ingredient in the successful delivery of the project was being empowered by the clarity of the brief. A world-class building to deliver world-class science. The project had and met fixed financial constraints. It considered carefully how to balance the energy associated with the demanding scientific work with passive building design. It won the Stirling Prize, amongst other industry awards, but the ultimate measurement of its success would be in Nobel Prize nominations. Yes, it's an exceptional project in many ways, but my point here is that the brief and its focus and definition of success would be about the users and the work that went on in the building. I'm suggesting the right brief for a building with less enduring expectations should clearly and honestly identify whether it needs to be adaptable for change, or even that it should be dismountable, reusable, or recyclable in 25, 40, 60, however many years. By way of an example, I was involved with an office redevelopment project in the mid-2000s for an owner-occupier client in Chisel Street, in the city of, on the edge of the City of London. Our project replaced their 1955 building, so about 50 years on. The 50s building, whilst it was simple, robust, and kind of handsome in a way, it had been outpaced by the demands of technology and lacked roots and risers for data and power and the means of dealing with the resulting heat gains. At the same time, a neighbouring building across the road was also under construction, and we had a grandstand view of the process. And it's this I'd like to pick out. That building today you'll recognise as British Land's Ropemaker Place. It was recognised as an innovative office building for its time upon completion. The building it replaced had also been a project with which Arup was involved and which was completed in 1987. And itself was a response to deregulation of the financial markets and the need to integrate new technologies into the workplace. And it replaced an older building, again of about 50 to 60 years of life. One of my team on our project had worked on the predecessor to 25 Ropemaker Place, and he was still quite proud of the robust engineering that he had had a part in creating. And clearly, like me, was quite appalled that 20 years later the building was being pulled down when it probably could have endured for 3 times that timescale. My point here is we can't anticipate every aspect and impact of change, whatever that might be, whatever might lead to that redevelopment, but we should consider and define carefully building life, adaptability, and ultimately the dismantling of a building. If buildings are for the people who use them, how do we close the feedback loop between brief, design, construction, and operation? Even if your measure of success is capital cost alone, ultimately the worth, lettability, reputation, and life of the building will come back to how well it works for its occupants, whatever their business or activity. Sadly, I think many buildings fall at the first hurdle of success, the brief. Essentially, because the brief doesn't thoroughly incorporate users' needs, or indeed their abilities to operate the building, and their understanding of the potential a new building can provide them in their business or activity. Somewhat inevitably, the design response to a brief which is flawed will be based on flawed assumptions. And finally, when we transition from construction to handover and operation, the responsibility for operation will be unsatisfactory because the people will not have had a role in the brief. The University of Cambridge deal with this handover period by procuring a 3-year relationship between designer, constructor and end user from practical completion. A knowledge that they gain over their large estate of buildings and new buildings commissioned is gathered through review and applied to the next projects whilst they're still in the briefing and early design stages. For me, our challenge is to capture and learn from real feedback over time, in our case, relatively short periods compared to historic time, and sharing this knowledge widely to allow robust briefing and long-term design responses, and understand the ingredients of success where it's achieved, in this example, through the reuse of a building that was a great platform for a new art space. Giving users the opportunity to provide feedback and taking both specific actions in response to them and influencing strategic briefs for the future surely has to be a route to better buildings and happier, more productive occupants. Here, for example, the recent BCEO award-winning headquarters office for Argent. Again, a repurposing of a historic building that had many robust and long-term qualities. Looking ahead, we have ever wider means of collecting data and feedback through digital media. The iPhone in your pockets and social media platforms at your desk are a part of modern life. It's your window to the world, and it's also your outlet, your mouthpiece, so there's a two-way feedback process possible. If the humble domestic thermostat can learn your behaviour and preferences, as well as be linked to your phone so you can talk to it, This is surely a clue to how we should make up our armoury for the future. We have an ageing population and longer working lives, which means a wider range of ages, work styles and attitudes than ever before in the workplace. Do we consider the diversity of environmental and spatial needs in our briefing and designs? How do we learn what these are now and what they might be in the future? Truly standing the test of time might therefore now mean harnessing innovative communication applications and turning the often unintended consequences of digital media to our advantage. Thank you.
Do you think there's a lot more that we could learn from historic buildings that we've forgotten about? And if so, when? I mean, how recently? When did we start forgetting it?
I don't think we've suddenly forgot those things, and I think there are fashions and periods in which we better remember the lessons of the past. Crises tend to, like energy crises, tend to prompt consideration of energy saving and using energy efficiently. Those in the past have renewed interest in passive design techniques. My own interest in that topic came from one of those in the past. So I don't think it's that we've forgotten. I think it's just sort of somewhere in that great sort of pot of ingredients to a building, and not always the first one we look at when we're considering how to make successful spaces. Of course, my perspective as an environmental designer might be a bit different to that of an architect or a client, but I think they ought to have equal footing in the debate and discussion that goes into developing a building response.
Some of the precedents that you showed, perhaps all of them, were produced in a much more holistic manner in terms of the design effort. And I was just wondering whether you thought there is an issue and a potential problem for us as designers in the early 21st century, that the design process, whilst becoming much more specialised, has in some cases become more fragmented. And if we all look back on our careers, the best projects are those in which different disciplines worked collaboratively together. And actually, it's quite difficult to achieve that these days. So I'm just interested in your thoughts on that and whether you think that's going to change in the future.
I pretty much agree with everything you've just said, and share those own sort of reflections on successful projects. You said it's difficult to achieve it. I think what I'm trying to say is if you define what success should look like, then you ensure that you put the right things in place to achieve it, as opposed to it being an accident or a chance outcome from what was a disparate process. So for me, it's thinking very hard about what, and even if success is simply that first pre-let, it's clearly defining that so that you then employ the right team, you involve the right people, and they work in a way that delivers.
It was really funny, really interesting, and yeah, it developed a good idea, and I thought that led also to something demonstrating we need to do more post-occupancy studies in order to integrate the end-user wishes and requirements. That's urgent. We are trying to reintegrate all buildings and give them new uses, so we need to take into account the requirements of offices requirements, building requirements, commercial requirements, so this is very important for us. And so yeah, it was a good talk.
I thought it was excellent, yeah. I think the part about learning from historic buildings in terms of passive design is something that I'm quite passionate about, and I think that a lot of the technology we use these days doesn't necessarily make our buildings more sustainable. One of the key things is we do a sustainable design specification for each of our new buildings, and as part of that we try and look at not just ticking boxes, but actually designing a building that's going to be fit for the users and sustainable in all of the senses rather than just being green.
I thought it was very, very good. I think it was very informative and very timely, actually, yeah, as well. Sort of suits where we're trying to make the industry go, I think, at the moment. There's a lot of commercial pressure on to force it backwards at the moment, but I think it has to because of the social and political pressures will force it in that direction.
Yeah, it's very good. Yeah, it was lots of food for thought, and we just carried on the discussion with a couple of your colleagues over a cup of coffee there, particularly in terms of the latter part of the talk and talking about feedback from occupants, how you can design a building for an occupant that you don't know who that's going to be in the future, and those sorts of issues, and how you actually then feed that occupancy information back into the next design of a future building. So I think in terms of that part of the talk in particular was of interest to me. We've had quite a bit of sort of wringing of hands and gnashing of teeth on the subject over the last couple of years or so, and we've introduced much more in the way of occupancy feedback, questionnaires, general feedback from tenants. I mean, the key to all of this is, before we actually start designing the building itself, is understanding what your market is. So therefore we're second guessing what sort of tenant we're going to get into a particular building, and making sure we design as sort of flexibly as we can to accommodate any tenant in that particular market. And then in terms of gaining feedback, we have tenant questionnaires, constant feedback through the asset management team of what the tenant's experience in the building is. And then we try and feed that back through internal seminars and some of the issues. I was just talking to the guys over there about one particular issue that came up from that, is that we like our cantilevered toilet bowls. And we found out from one building that the ladies were opening the doors to the cubicles and standing on the bowls so they could see themselves in the mirror. So we had trouble with toilet pans coming off the wall and all this sort of stuff. So good example of how we kind of try and feed that back into how we might get over that in the future.
Yeah, I thought Guy was really insightful in what he was presenting. Obviously, use of buildings and reuse of buildings, it's an ongoing factor of what we're doing. It's always a great event to come to the Arup breakfast, and the topics that are presented are so wide and diverse that Guy's presentation really fit the bill this morning and was a good eye-opener and a good start to the day.